Welcome to Trust Talk. Our guest today is Rainee, the director of the Pew Research Center's Internet and Technology Research Group. Despite a decline in trust, especially towards major technology companies and institutions due to privacy concerns and doubts about reliability, people remain engaged in online activities. The Internet has seamlessly integrated into modern life for essential tasks like banking and shopping. We explore various factors contributing to the declining trust, including historical events eroding trust in institutions. The Internet has further magnified these trends by exposing institutional shortcomings, leading to suspicions and concerns. Additionally, political polarization plays a significant role, with citizens experiencing heightened mistrust in today's divisive political climate. Trust comes down to a transactional calculation influenced by context-specific factors, reflecting the complexity of motivations and perceptions. We also delve into the research methodologies employed by Pew, with online surveys becoming more prevalent due to declining phone poll response rates. However, ensuring representative samples remains crucial to gaining accurate insights. Your host today, Severin DeWitt.
Lee, welcome to Trust Talk. Thank you for being our guest today.
It's wonderful to be here.
We're diving into the topic of online trust and its future. As we increasingly rely on the internet for various aspects of our lives, concerns about trust and security have become more prominent. In an article from Pew called "The Fate of Online Trust in the Next Decade," it is highlighted that the internet was not initially designed with trust in mind. Additionally, the rise of social media and digital interactions has coincided with the decline in trust. In light of these challenges, my question is, will people's trust in their online interactions, their work, their shopping, their social connections, and pursuit of knowledge be strengthened or diminished?
Well, it's a marvelous and important question, and I think there are two parts to it. In the aspect of online trust, I think there's a good case to be made that trust will continue to decline. Major technology companies are not a favored group of enterprises. There are ways in which privacy and trust and confidence in institutions all interact in these spaces. And so when you ask people the question, do you trust the online environment, or do you trust the companies that are important to you in the online environment, you might get answers where people say, I don't trust them. Nevertheless, the second part of the question that is implied is, will they stop doing things online? And I don't think that is likely to happen. The internet has become so deeply integrated into our lives that it's impossible not to have banking transactions without using the internet. It is hard to purchase things without having access to the internet. It is much easier to live your life with access to internet tools. It is much easier to deal with other people, even if you don't trust them. There might be declines in trust that very much are tied to declines in institutions. But at the same time, we will see none of the metrics of online usage going down. And that's the big challenge. As we study trust over the years, of course, the story about how decline in institutions and the internet interact is an interesting one. Of course, decline in trust in institutions is a story that began long before the internet became part of people's lives. The Vietnam War in the United States, the Watergate scandals, CIA scandals, the scandals of the Reagan administration, the poor performance of government in some areas, the poor performance of banks and businesses and churches and other institutions has been a major thing that are on people's minds when we ask them, do you trust these institutions or not? The internet put many of these trends on steroids. There are ways now that they could find out about things that were difficult about these institutions much more easily than they could in the pre-internet era. And at the same time, the internet became embedded in people's lives. So even as they might not necessarily trust the online environment, they were becoming more and more interested in using it and more dependent on its affordances. Then, of course, you get the Great Recession. So the big problem that banks created in the 2008-2009 arena, the rise of President Trump in the United States and the rise of right-wing nationalist organizations, polarization in political cultures. The pandemic has been a major influence on trust. So a lot of things are swirling around in this subject. And I think there's some case to be made that people are much more concerned and wary than they used to be. I don't think, though, that they will stop buying things online, or that they will stop interacting with other people online, or that they will stop interacting with institutions online, because it is such an essential part of life now.
You just referred to the Americans that feel that declining trust in institutions. Do you think that many Americans feel that this declining trust in institutions or in the government and in each other has made it increasingly difficult to address critical problems? According to a survey conducted by your organization, a majority of adults believe that confidence in the US government and in fellow citizens is shrinking, which in turn hampers the national ability to solve key issues. Can you share some insights into why trust has eroded, both in the federal government, apart from what you just said about the crisis that we have been seeing in the last 10, 20 years? What impact this decline has on government performance and personal relationships?
As Americans see it, they see a vicious circle rather than a virtuous circle unfolding. So they're watching their government and they're watching their fellow citizens, and they see more and more evidence that the government institutions are not performing well, that business institutions are not performing well, or churches are not performing well, or media organizations are not performing well. And so that fuels their suspicions and concerns about trusting these institutions. At the same time, there are other things going on above and beyond what's going on online that drive some of these feelings. As I say, the rise of polarization and all of its attendant pieces is a major part of why people are less trusting of each other than they used to be. There's a sense now that politics is a blood sport. It's not just argument over policy. It's an argument about who is evil and who is good, whether right will prevail or wrong will prevail. So there's this sense that the people on the other side are not necessarily just policy opponents or partisan or political opponents. They are bad people who, if they take over, are going to make life worse. So the stakes feel higher. At the same time that dynamic is unfolding, people are very frustrated here, and especially in Europe, that their governments don't seem to be able to do anything. So that there is a sense of stasis or the sense of stagnation in government institutions, and people are frustrated that government actors seem hampered in addressing major problems like the climate problems, like the pandemic, like misinformation and weaponized information. So even as people are concerned about their neighbors and how reliable their neighbors are, they're also frustrated that there is no capacity now to solve big public problems. The other thing that's part of the internet environment is that people are convinced that the other party doesn't even agree on the same facts. So you can't solve problems if people don't agree on the reality that they're trying to address or the problems that they're trying to solve. There's a very strong sense among Americans in particular that the policymakers can't even agree what the problem is, much less what a solution would be.
Lee, you have been involved in studying online trust extensively. One notable trust study that often comes to mind is from your colleagues at Edelman, the Edelman's Annual Trust Barometer. While both Pew Research Center and Edelman aim to understand trust dynamics, their approaches and their findings may differ. Could you shed some light on the potential variations between Pew Research Center's results and those of other trust studies like Edelman's Annual Trust Barometer, and how do you perceive these differences and what factors might contribute to divergent findings?
The first thing to say about all the trust work that's being done by major institutions, including the Pew Research Center, the Edelman Trust Barometer, and the Gallup organization, is that we are finding much the same thing. Our findings basically are the same. The trends we are finding are basically the same. The decline in trust that we are finding lines up pretty nicely, and we are not in dispute about that. At Edelman, they're very, very interested they're a strategic communications firm, and they're very interested in companies and brands and the role of business in addressing societal problems or just sitting in their cultures. We are less concerned at Pew with those kind of issues. There are really strong organizations like Edelman that do that kind of research, particularly for the maintenance and support of brands and major companies. We're a philanthropy, and we don't need to study that. We are much more interested in democratic institutions, public institutions, NGOs, and their role in society. We do work related to companies, but not nearly as much as Edelman does. The other thing is that Edelman is very focused on trust and does this annual survey. Many of the questions in their survey repeat year after year so that you get trend data on these things in multiple countries. In our surveys, we mostly are concentrating on the United States. We do global polling, but it's a lot about geopolitics, the role of the United States in the world, the role of the EU in the world, the role of China in the world, how people feel about their cultures and globalization. But the main emphasis that we place on trust comes from domestic studies. So that's partly accounting for some of the variance that you're picking up. The other thing that we're all trying to do in this space is to ask really interesting, nuanced, new questions about the issues related to trust. And as I say, Edelman is very interested in the role of corporations and macroeconomics in this story. We are very focused on politics and polarization and things like that. So that's part of what people might be seeing. There's some different emphases in our work, but the overall findings are very similar. There isn't very much difference between us in the general things we're saying about the state of trust in societies, the state of trust around the world, and the way people are interacting with each other in companies and institutions.
Anybody who would jump into this conversation in the middle would think that we are all very negative on trust. But it's not all crisis in trust, is there? Pew has documented some fascinating ways in which trust in institutions and media is still alive and well. What's going on there?
When we began to see trust becoming a major problem in cultures around the world, particularly in the United States, one of the responses that we made in our surveys was to begin to unpack the ideas related to trust in big institutions. So people will say they don't trust the government. We began asking questions about different functions and different institutions inside government. And there's really interesting variance. Some organizations have high trust. The United States Postal Service has high trust. The Space Agency has high trust. The Food and Drug Administration has high trust. The tax collectors, not so much.
Not surprisingly, right?
Yeah, exactly. But it's a very interesting, nuanced, distributed, varied story rather than a uniform, everybody hates everything kind of story. The same thing happens in the other institutions that we look at. So you ask people if they trust the media or not, or different segments of the media, newspapers, broadcasts, cable, or whatever, they will say no. But when we ask them about their favorite news organizations, they are very happy with specific places. In the United States, that means high quality newspapers for some people. It means partisan cable operations for other people. So people trust segments of the news industry, even though they say they don't trust news organizations overall. That's also the same across the board with other kinds of institutions like businesses. There are some businesses people like and some businesses that they don't. So it's a very interesting distributed story. One of the things that we've picked up in our data over the years when we ask Americans about this is that trust is a very transactional kind of calculation that they make. They are making it in the moment with another human being or with another institution or with an online operation. It's not a blanket judgment that they're making. It's right in the moment. And what they tend to be weighing is the value I'm going to get out of this transaction better than the compromise or the problem that might arise from it? And if they think the benefit outweighs the problem, they will go ahead with the transaction.
Right, exactly.
And so there are ways in which trust is getting distributed Trust is getting contingent, very dependent on context, and trust is getting almost fractal. It goes in different places at different moments in people's lives.
Am I right in assuming that your work does not really align with those who think that the echo chambers created by social media are really the major cause of political polarization? Can you explain what you found and why the concept of echo chambers isn't a good explanation for trust problems?
I really like the idea that underlies the echo chamber argument. It's that people tend to like information that agrees with their point of view. And so they're sometimes seeking it out to make sure that the world is the way they want it to be. But what we have always found in our data when we began looking at this is that particularly for highly motivated partisans, people on the activist left and people on the activist right, they are so engaged with politics that they are very aware of what the other side thinks and does. So they are not shunning that information. They are not cutting off that information in an echo chamber. They actually want to know what the other side is thinking so that they can build their arguments in a better way. So what we're finding is that the most active political actors are highly engaged with all kinds of information, including information that disagrees with their point of view. But they're doing it, their motive for engaging all that information is to strengthen their own capacity to argue their case. So we think that the more interesting explanation for why people get the information they do is their level of partisanship, their level of civic engagement, their level of commitment to the political system.
Pew has issued numerous reports based on its surveys. And now comes a rather technical question. Can you tell us more of the methodology used by the Pew Center to conduct surveys and issue reports?
Yes, I'm happy to talk about our methodology because it's a really important part of the story. For many, many, many years, for decades, the polling industry was built around telephone polls. Pollsters would call your home line, usually at dinner time, and ask you questions about politics, about your life, about the products and services that you bought. Telephones worked really, really well for a long time. And at the high water mark of polling, more than 3/4 or 80% of respondents would answer the phone, and were happy to do so. They would sit and answer your questions because that was a civic act. They felt like it was their duty, and they were proud to be in part of a poll. That completely changed as people began to distrust institutions. People began to hate telemarketers for interrupting their dinners and interrupting their lives. And so the response rates that used to be so great for phone surveys began to decline. And the thing that we began to worry about was whether the people who were not answering their phones were different from the people who were answering their phones. Because if there was a difference, then you could not report in a scientific way that this is how the public felt, because you weren't able to talk to a certain part of the public. So we did some special studies every couple of years to try to figure out who those non-respondents were. And for a good long while, they were not terribly different from the people who answered surveys. That's why political polls were performing pretty well. But over time, again, as response rates continued to decline, the people who didn't answer became different from the people who did answer. And that became a problem. So Pew, the Pew Research Center where I work, and a lot of other organizations now stopped doing phone polling and are doing polling of samples. These are online samples where you get a link to a survey or you get a text message and then you complete the survey online rather than answering a phone call. The trick in doing it that way is to make sure you have a representative number of people responding to your survey. So some people assemble convenience surveys and they don't work very hard to get full representativeness. Pew works really hard to get representativeness because our polling is particularly important about the political culture in the United States. And if you're not getting everybody to answer your questions, you're not fully understanding what's going on in American politics. So we are now anchored in online polling for much of the work that we do. And that's helped the representativeness of our samples. It's helped us identify who we need to recruit to make sure we can fill in the gaps of the survey. But there are also issues that come from talking to people on web instruments, starting with the field that I care about, which is technology research, because if people don't use the internet, they're not nearly as willing to do an online survey as people who are familiar with the internet.
That brings me to a point that triggers me for quite a while. I've been so far doing over 75 interviews. And one of the things that strikes me, and it also relates to what you just said, is why do you think that academic researchers are less inclined to utilize the results and findings from organizations like Pew Center from their surveys, specifically focused on surveys rather than research, as they do themselves?
Well, I think our surveys, the Gallup surveys, the Edelman surveys, are used for people like political scientists who study citizen relationship to institutions. I think our work is cited and their work is cited in lots of academic papers, particularly related to the kinds of subjects that political scientists are interested in. My sense is that some academic researchers, of course, understand the things I was saying before, that trust is a very context-specific thing. For certain people, in certain ways, it's different from other people in other ways. And so many academics are focusing on special populations. Many academics are focusing on special interactions between you and your doctor, or between you and your mental health therapist, or you and the public health authorities in your community. And so I think a lot of academic research is a little bit more focused on specific domains than ours is. The other thing that actually relates to an earlier question you asked about why trust has declined. One of the potential big theories on this is that the rising level of inequality, particularly in the United States, but around the world, is part of it. It's fueling a sense of despair and distrust and cynicism that means that a lot of people in America think, the fix is in for rich people. The political system helps them, the corporate system helps them, the legal system helps them. And so I think there are ways in which people are studying that kind of thing, which hasn't been a central part of our work. So there are sort of different approaches to this subject. And I don't think it's the academic community not paying attention to our work. Often our work is the starting point. People are less trustful of each other. People are less trustful of institutions. And they're trying to get to the questions of why and how that's happening.
A question that comes up in my mind is in this time a survey, is that still the best way to get somebody's opinion on trust? Or should we look into more technologically advanced methods of getting to know what people feel and think about trust?
I think the best answer is all of the above. So surveys, however they're conducted, can give you certain kinds of answers, and they can give you really nice panoramic pictures of the full population. And there are higher tech and higher and more sophisticated ways to scrape social media, or to look at discussion groups online or listservs online and get a much more detail about why people think the way they do, why people act the way they do. But there's also a very low-tech way to get answers to that question that's still very valuable too, which is literally being in the field and doing in-depth interviews face-to-face with other people. It's been so striking to see that some of the most interesting new jobs that are being created at lots of companies, including tech companies, is the in-house anthropologist or the in-house ethnographer, who is literally going out and doing one-on-one interactions or very small-scale qualitative interactions to get at these issues of why people think the way they do, why they act the way they do, what's going on in their minds as they're making one transaction but not another transaction. So there's room for all of us. And we found at Pew that some of the most powerful work we do combines survey work with computational work from scraping data and gathering data from online sources.
Lee, I'm ending most of my interviews, and I will do so here as well, with the same question relating to the future. What do you perceive as the most significant challenge for future surveys focused on measuring trust?
I referred to one of them before, which is literally being sure that you're talking to a representative sample of the population you want to study. One of the problems that now has arisen in the low trust era is that some people don't trust pollsters, don't trust survey givers. And we are worried that they are the kind of people who will say to their neighbors, to their fellow citizens, I don't trust you, I don't trust the institutions, but they're not answering our surveys. So if we can't get to them to answer our questions, we're not getting a fully accurate reading on the state of trust and distrust in a society. I think the other part of this that comes from the conversation that we're having and your really nice questions is the definition of trust itself. Going back to the very first question, if you ask somebody if they trust Facebook or Google or Microsoft, they might say they don't. Will they use products from those companies? Oh, yes. So what's the real measure of trust? What they tell you or what they do? That's one of the paradoxes that we've seen in our trust work all the 25 years that we've been doing it. People will say one thing, particularly related to privacy, but then they will act a different way. And part of it relates to the dependence on technology that we were talking about before. Part of it relates to the appeal and convenience of technology. Even if I don't necessarily trust it, it's certainly easier to sit here and click on a transaction than have to get in my car and drive into town to make a purchase, right? The other part of it is everybody else in my life is doing this stuff. If I want to see what my friends are doing, I've got to be on social network sites, even though I don't like their surveillance practices. If I want to be in the know about the news and the culture, I've got to be online at online news sites because that's how I find out these things, but they're capturing my data and using my data. And so I think there are lots of tensions in the idea of what trust is and how people act it out in their lives. But I think the golden age of studying these things lies ahead of us because we are now beginning to understand those things. And that's the agenda for the next period of research that we're going to encounter.
So we are probably facing very challenging times in trust and trust research. Well, thank you very much for enlightening us on that subject, and wish you all the best with your future research work. And thank you for being available for the Trust Talk podcast.
It was a great conversation. I really appreciated it. Thank you.
Thank you for joining us for another episode of Trust Talk. We hope that you found the conversation valuable and informative. At Trust Talk, we believe in the power of trust to create positive change in the world. If you believe in our mission, we would greatly appreciate your support. You can help keep Trust Talk going by making a donation on our website at trusttalk.co/donate. Every contribution, no matter how small, helps us to continue bringing you thoughtful and engaging podcasts. Thank you for your support and for listening to Trust Talk. We look forward to meeting you again for future episodes.